In the vehicle you were in, it was a black Lexus. Where were you sitting? I was in the back seat, passenger side. As you were driving to Club 662, was there a shooting? He says there was. And can you describe the events that led up to the shooting? He said, we were on our way to Club 662. Mr. Shakur and Knight were in the car in front of us. We approached the light. Some women drove up passenger side. Mr. Shakur began talking to the women. We really couldn't hear what he was saying. We assumed they was probably inviting him to the club. Asked him, was he okay? How's he doing? Trying to see, what condition he was in. And does Mr. Shakur respond at all? He says he does. And what did Mr. Shakur say? Get on the ground, they're going to shoot you. And what is he referring to? He's referring to the officers who were eventually at the scene. Cadillac, how many people did you see? From my vantage point, I saw 3 people. Okay, all right. Were there any tattoos or anything on the arm that you saw? Not that I recall. I'm going to move to grand jury exhibit number 12. On this right hand, did it appear to be an injury? She says yes. Did you form an opinion on what that was? She says yes. This was a through and through gunshot wound of its kind of third or fourth finger, depending on whether you count the thumb as first. This is a through and through gunshot wound through his finger. So it appears that Mr. Shakur had 2 penetrating gunshot wounds and 1 perforating gunshot wound. Correct. And based on your review of the wounds at the Clark County Coroner's Office, as well as more photographs than this, did you form an opinion as the cause of death to Mr. Shakur? She says yes. And he says, what was that? He died of multiple gunshot wounds. And did you have an opinion on the matter of death? She says yes. He says, what is that? And he says homicide. Welcome back to another video with ID and TV, man. We're covering Tupac and Keffe D's grand jury testimony. This is part 2. If you guys haven't seen the part 1, make sure you check it out. This one is from an eyewitness who was directly behind Tupac's car. He gives all the nitty-gritty information. Then also, we have a doctor who performed the autopsy on Tupac. She explains everything that happened. Watch this video complete. Make sure you hit the thumbs up. This is an exclusive. If you guys don't know, Malcolm Greenlich is actually Idi Amin. He was with the Outlaws, and he was Tupac's little homie. He was actually subpoenaed to come. So he wasn't a person that came forward. They actually contacted him and made him come to the grand jury. So we're going to start right off. They says, Mr. Greenlich, so we're clear, you're under subpoena, is that correct? He says, this is correct. Excuse me, we didn't get his last name. He says it's Greenlich. He spells out his last name. Now, Greenlich, so you're here under subpoena, is that correct? He says, this is correct. And under your understanding, that's a court order for you to appear. He says, I understand that. Do you know somebody by the name of Tupac Shakur? He says, I did. Now, how did you know Mr. Shakur? He says, we were childhood friends. Did that friendship continue throughout adulthood? He said it did. Now, until his ultimate passing, he says, did you have both a personal and professional relationship with Mr. Shakur? He said, I did. Can you describe the nature of the professional relationship you had with Mr. Shakur? He says, I was a recording artist and he was essentially my mentor, the person who got me into the business. And did you have a group, part of a rap name that you were associated with? He said, I did. He said, what was the name of the group? He says, the Outlaws. He says, do you know somebody by the name of Marion Suge Knight? He says, I did. And he said, how do you know Mr. Knight? He was the CEO of the label that Tupac Shakur was on. And what was the name of that label? Death Row Records. As a result of Mr. Knight being the CEO of Death Row Records, did you have a lot of interaction with him? Idi Amin says, I did. Where was Death Row Records located? He says, Los Angeles. And as a recording artist, did you record at Death Row Studios? He says, correct. And would you record with Mr. Shakur? He said, I did. I'm going to fast forward now to 95, 96. In that time frame, were you recording with Mr. Shakur and other Death Row artists? He says, this is correct. Now, at the time, were you aware of, let's say, I'm trying to put this in a vernacular, a disagreement or a rivalry between Death Row Records and Bad Boy record companies? He agrees, that is correct. Okay, can you describe a little bit of what your understanding of what the rivalry was? Well, what is common in hip hop is the competitive nature of hip hop. And it was like what we would call a rap beef. And that's the word I want us to say, but just for vernacular here. So is it common or uncommon in the hip hop world for there to be disagreements or insults traded in rap artists? He says this is correct. It is common, he said, it can be at some times. He says, okay, is it fair to say it's a part of the hip hop culture? The competitive side of it, it is. At the time, you were aware of songs made by the Bad Boy album or Bad Boy signed artists taking shots at Death Row artists? He said, not really. He says, were you aware of the songs at the time that Death Row had performed, or you in particular had performed that you were taking shots at Bad Boy artists? He says, we did a song. He said, okay, and what was the same of that? He says some songs. The most famous one was Hit 'Em Up. And was that in the 96 era? He says this is correct. All right, and he said that you were childhood friends with Mr. Shakur, and you also had a professional working relationship with Mr. Shakur. Is it fair to say that during this period, particularly between 1995 and 1996, you were spending a lot of time with Mr. Shakur? This is correct. I want to fast forward to September 7th, 1996. Were you in Las Vegas that time? He says yes. And what were you in Las Vegas for? To go to a boxing event and a party later on that night. And with the regards of going to the boxing event, do you recall at least one or two fighters that were involved in the boxing event? He said, I do. And who was involved in this boxing event? He said Mike Tyson and Bruce Seldon. And with regards to getting here to Vegas, you were living in LA during this time period. He says, I was. He says, how did you get to LA to Vegas? I was in Tupac's fiance's car at the time. Who was his fiance? Kadada Jones. Was Miss Jones also one of the people that came out to Las Vegas? He agreed. And do you recall who else came to Vegas with you or the group? Tupac's cousin, two of his cousins, and another childhood friend. And then Mr. Shakur and Mr. Knight also came out. They did. And then you mentioned your rap group, The Outlaws. Were there any members of the rap group that were out there as well? Yes. Who were they? Can I say their rap names or no? I'll take their real names. He says, Kachara Cox, Yafu Fula. Thank you. Where did you end up staying that night, September 7th, 1996? We stayed at the Luxor Hotel. Did you share a room with anybody? I shared a room with Fula and Cox. And those were two co-members or two members of the Outlaws? That is correct. What was the plan for that night? The plan was to go to the fight and then go to a party. Do you remember where the fight was? The MGM. Who were you supposed to go with to the fight? Tupac, Fula, Cox, Mr. Knight. That's all I'm aware of. Okay, did you actually end up going to the fight with Mr. Knight and Shakur? No, we did not. What happened? Mr. Shakur left before we were ready. And then at some point, how did you discover Mr. Shakur had left to go to the MGM? We called his hotel room. Did anybody answer his hotel room? Yes, who answered? It was either his fiance or his cousin. I'm not really clear on that. Now, what did you do when you found out that Mr. Shakur already left to go to the MGM Grand? We leave to go to the MGM. And by we, who do you mean? Fula, Cox, and myself. So how did three of you get to the MGM? We run. Okay, fair. By the time you get there, what happens? Mr. Shakur and Knight coming out the MGM Grand. Were you under the impression that the boxing match had ended at that point? Yes. So what did you do? Did you meet up with Mr. Knight and Shakur outside the MGM? We did. And what did you do then? It was Mr. Knight and Mr. Shakur leaving out with a bunch of people following behind them, fans, things of that nature. So we kind of just stepped in stride with them. At some point, you make it back to the Luxor? Yes. Did you know if Mr. Shakur had changed his clothing from what he wore to the fight after leaving the Luxor? Yes, he did eventually change. Now, when you are ultimately leaving the Luxor, where were you planning on going? To the party. And you talked about this party a couple of times. Where was the party? Club called 662. In this club 662, were you aware of who was in charge of the club? Yeah, I was. Who was in charge of it? Who actually owned it? I don't know who was in charge, but who owned it, but I was under the impression that Mr. Knight owned it. So it's fair to say that it was a place that Death Row artists or people associated with Death Row would feel comfortable to hang out and go there. Yes. Was there expected to be a performance at 662? It was. And who was expected to perform? Tupac. And you were one of the people that might perform as well, right? Yes, that is correct. With your group Outlaws? Correct. Now tell me how you get from Luxor to 662. Do you run a club 662 or how do you get there? No, we did not run. We took a vehicle, a car. And how many vehicles were associated with your party? I'm not really sure. I was aware that one of the vehicles we were in, the vehicle that Pac and Suge Knight were in. Now, fair to say you were both a friend of Mr. Shakur and a recording artist yourself. This is correct. So obviously, you have no role in security or anything like that. You wasn't professionally responsible. I am not a professional security person. Were you aware if Mr. Shakur and Mr. Knight had professional security? He said I was. And the vehicle that you took to the club, who was in that vehicle? Me, myself, Fula, Cox, and Tupac's security guard. What was Tupac's security guard's name? Frank. Were you aware whether or not Frank was armed? Eventually, I was aware of the status. And by eventually, do you mean after this incident or before this incident? Pretty much right before the incident. Okay. And it's so obvious that you're here for a shooting. So when I say the incident, I mean became aware that Frank, the security guard, did not have a firearm. We became aware of that, yes. Okay, what car were you in? Well, can you describe the car that you were in? It was a Lexus. And what color was it? Black. And can you describe the vehicle that Mr. Shakur was in? It was a BMW. And what color was it? Black. And was there anybody in the car with Mr. Shakur? It says Mr. Knight. And do you recall who was driving and who was in the passenger seat? He says, who was in the passenger seat? He says, I do. Who was in what seat? Mr. Knight was driving, Shakur was in the passenger seat. And is this fairly typical? He says, no. So it was unusual for it to happen that night? It wasn't unusual, but it was only unusual because Mr. Knight and Mr. Shakur didn't always ride together. Okay. In the vehicle you were in, it was a black Lexus. Where were you sitting? I was in the back seat, passenger side. As you were driving to Club 662, was there a shooting? He says there was. And can you describe the events that led up to the shooting? He said, we were on our way to Club 662. Mr. Shakur and Knight were in the car in front of us. We approached the light. Some women drove up passenger side. Mr. Shakur began talking to the women. We really couldn't hear what he was saying. We assumed they was probably inviting them to the club. After the ladies pull up, another car pulled up beside Mr. Shakur and Mr. Knight, and an arm came out of the back window and began shooting. Can you describe the car that came up beside Mr. Shakur's vehicle? It was a white or light colored Cadillac. And at the time, would you describe it as a really old Cadillac or a newer Cadillac? It was a newer model Cadillac. Did you see the people inside the vehicle? I could see silhouettes. Could you tell the race of the people inside the vehicle? He said, I could. And what was their race? African American. Now you said that you saw the arm reach out the vehicle. Could you tell by the skin tone whether or not of that arm, what race of the person that arm belonged to? He said, I could. And what race was it? African American. Now with regards to the size of the arm, how would you describe it? He says it was a larger size arm, muscular. So not necessarily a thin arm, it was not. Okay, what did you do? Strike that. And how many shots did you recall seeing? I don't remember how many shots it was, but it was more than 5. And what did you do when you saw the shots? He said, nothing. Was there anything that you felt that you could do at that moment? He said, nothing at all. They asked, did you see the Cadillac after it shot more than 5 times? He said, I did not. He says, what were you focused on? I was focused on Mr. Shakur and his safety and his condition. What happens after the Cadillac shoots Mr. Shakur's car? Mr. Knight made a U-turn over the median and start going in the opposite direction. Are you telling who is driving the vehicle you're in? Frank is still driving that vehicle. And are you telling Frank what to do, or does Frank decide to do something? Frank had jumped out the car to check on Mr. Knight and Mr. Shakur before we turned. Mr. Knight turned and Frank came and got back in the car and began to follow. Did you and any other members of the vehicle or the people have a firearm? He said no. To your knowledge, that night, did either Mr. Shakur or Mr. Knight have a firearm that night? He said, not to my knowledge. He said, okay, and you said that you wasn't aware who was driving in your entourage or in your group. Were you aware there was more than 2 vehicles associated with your group? He says, I was aware of that. You just don't know exactly who was in each vehicle, right? He says, correct. He says, do you know who or who would know whether or not any of those people in the group would have firearms? I did not know. Okay, do you recall seeing, after the shots from the Cadillac, do you recall seeing or hearing any other people shoot that was from your group at the white Cadillac? He said, I did not. Is it possible that it occurred and you didn't see it? He says, I can't testify to that. In the moment, our attention was completely on the car Mr. Knight and Shakur was in. So when Mr. Alexander gets back in the vehicle, and I'm sorry, I said Mr. Alexander. What's Frank's full name? Frank Alexander. He says, so when Mr. Alexander gets back into the vehicle, what does Mr. Alexander do? He turns and goes in the direction that Mr. Shakur and Knight were heading in. Do you ultimately catch up with Tupac and Suge? He says, we do. And what do you do when you catch up with Mr. Knight and Mr. Shakur's vehicle? I eventually get out of the car and run up to Mr. Shakur's side. How was the vehicle positioned? Do you remember? Was it parked properly, or was it it was kind of in a state of, no, it wasn't parked properly, to answer your question. Is it fair to say that it looked like someone who might been panicking or driving? Correct. You say that you approached the passenger side of the vehicle, the passenger side of the BMW, is that right? He says, this is correct. And he said, why did you do that? Because that's where Mr. Shakur was sitting. And what do you do when you get to the passenger side of the vehicle? Asked him, was he okay? How's he doing? Trying to see, what condition he was in. And does Mr. Shakur respond at all? He says he does. And what did Mr. Shakur say? Get on the ground, they're going to shoot you. And what is he referring to? He's referring to the officers who were eventually at the scene. So when you approach the BMW, at that point, have you noticed the police officers? I did not. And then you're told to get on the ground. At that point, do you start looking around? Yes. And what do you see? A gun. And who's holding the gun? A police officer. And is the police officer giving you instructions? He is. And what is he telling you to do? Get on the ground or I'll shoot. So what did you do? I got on the ground. Are you actually detained at the scene? He says we were. And by we, are you also referring to the 3 other people in the vehicle? He said correct. Are you able to observe what's happening with Mr. Knight and Mr. Shakur while this is going on? He said somewhat. Mr. Knight was bleeding from his head. He was on the ground urging the paramedics to check on Mr. Shakur. So at that point, Mr. Knight, primarily concerned was also Mr. Shakur? Correct. And are you seeing anything going on with Mr. Shakur? I'm noticing. Well, at first, I'm noticing he was very calm. He wasn't moving much. Then after that, we were laying, and we were basically laying on the ground in the street, and I couldn't see what was going on. Did you hear either Mr. Knight or Mr. Shakur say anything while on the ground? He said, I did not. And at that point, it's early September night in Las Vegas. Is it fair to say it was particularly hot while you're on the asphalt? He said it was hot as hell. And were you on the asphalt for short or a long period of time? We were on the asphalt for what seemed like a very long time. At some point, do the police ultimately realize that you are not involved as the shooter, but rather as a victim or a witness? They do. And as a result, do they let you go? He said, not right away. What do? They begin questioning us about the shooting. And they said, in fact, you gave a taped statement regarding the shooting. He said, I'm aware that I did now. You came to my office yesterday. Is that true? This is correct. And that's where you became aware that you had a statement that was recorded. I do. Okay, fairly short statement. Is it fair to say? Is that a yes? That's a yes. And then you also gave probably a 1 or 2 sentence written statement as well. Is that correct? This is correct. At that point, you're ultimately allowed to leave. Yes. Where do you go? We went to the hospital. Is that the University Medical Center? Yes. And what did you do at UMC? We prayed. Are you aware that Mr. Shakur passes away come 6 days after? I'm aware. Were you here in Las Vegas during that time? Yes. Why were you here? Because he was still in the hospital. Did you see Mr. Shakur inside the hospital room? I did. Were you one of the people that could go in? He said, this is correct. Were you also one of the people that, seen Mr. Shakur's mother also at the hospital? He said, I did. And that would be Afeni Shakur? He said, Afeni Shakur, yes. All right, at some point you learned that Mr. Shakur has passed away. Is that correct? He says, correct. Now, how did you learn that? His mother pretty much told everybody. This is something that's going to sound like a silly question, and I apologize for it. Since that day, have you ever heard from Mr. Shakur? He says, I have not. So in your statement, do you recall seeing 2 people on the front, on the driver's side of the vehicle, and then the driver's passenger? What vehicle are you talking about? I'm sorry, in the white Cadillac, how many people did you see? From my vantage point, I saw 3 people. Okay, all right. State has no further questions for this witness. Do any members of the grand jury have a question? So the grand jury had a few questions, and they said this. Where is 662 as you were where you were going? He says, I don't know. I didn't know Vegas at the time. I didn't even know where we were going. I didn't even know where the club was. So was it towards the Luxor where you were staying, or was it the opposite direction? It was away from the hotel. Okay. What was the name you performed under? Idi Amin. Any other questions? So the juror has some more questions. So you say that the arm came out of the back side, not the front where the driver was. The arm came out of the passenger side or the back seat of the driver's side. Okay, thank you. Were there any tattoos or anything on the arm that you saw? Not that I recall. And just so we're clear, this occurred at nighttime in the hours of the day. He said it was dark outside. And then the juror had one last question. It said, were you able to get the license plate of the Cadillac? He says, I was not. Thank you. Any more questions? No questions. The doctor that actually performed his autopsy had to speak in front of the grand jury, and they recorded her testimony. Now they asked, doctor, how are you employed? She says, I am a forensic pathologist medical examiner here in Clark County. How long have you been a forensic pathologist? A little over 13 years, going on 14 soon. And how long have you been in Clark County? The same. Can you generally describe your education background and licensing? I went to the school at the University of Connecticut School of Medicine. I did a pathology residency at the Hartford Hospital in Connecticut. I did a surgical pathology fellowship at Hartford Hospital in Connecticut. I did forensic pathology fellowship at the Office of the Medical Investigator in New Mexico. And when I came here to Clark County, I have a medical license to practice in the state of Nevada, and I'm board certified in atomic pathology and forensic pathology. I'm going to imagine that you didn't hold at all. Well, certainly didn't have a license to practice medicine in the state of Nevada in 1996. She said correct. Okay, since you have been at the medical examiner's office, did you learn of a formal medical examiner by the name of Dr. Jordan? She says yes. And have you had on any occasion had to review his work as well as his underlying documentation to form your own opinions related to the cause and matter of death? She says yes. And then they ask, can you estimate how many times you had to do it way before? Probably would estimate it to 24 or so. Okay, so I'm going to direct your attention to an autopsy which was conducted on an individual that is identified by Tupac Shakur, also known as Lassane Crooks. Were you asked to review certain documentation, photograph in order to form your own opinion as the cause and matter of death of Mr. Shakur? Yes. Let's talk about what you had. Did you have a report from an investigator that had responded to the hospital when Mr. Shakur died? She says yes. And also, did you have an autopsy report that was dictated by Dr. Robert Jordan? Yes. Now, back in 1996, did the medical examiner's office document their autopsies with photographs in the same type of way they do today? She says no. It says, what did the office of the medical examiner really have for documentation for photographs? She says they did a certain combination of either Polaroids or they actually had film in their cameras at the time. They asked, based on what I supplied you, well, basically a link to the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department crime scene photograph from this autopsy? And she says yes. Now, did you have an opportunity to review all of those? She says yes. Now, after reviewing all of those, you were able to form an opinion as the cause and matter of death? And she says yes. So I'm going to go through a few of these exhibits that somebody already laid the foundation for. This is Grand Jury Exhibit number 9. This is one of the photographs that you were able to look at during the course of your forming your opinion. She says yes. And essentially, this was an overall photograph of Mrs. Shakur on September 13th, 1996. She says correct. Did you learn during the course of your review that he had actually been shot or injured 7 days before? She says yes. And that he had medical intervention, and there's evidence of this photograph of substantial medical intervention. She says yes. So let me move on to the course of your review. I want you to start with the top down. Essentially, there is what is some pretty obvious medical intervention, but there was a gunshot wound to the chest. She says yes. And can you see generally where that gunshot wound is identified here in photo number 10? She says yes. Now, I actually have a little toy for you. There's a pointer. Can you point out us the general area where the entrance room was? She says yeah, it's right there on the right lateral aspect of the chest near the axilla. Okay, and did you learn the path of that particular wound? She says yes. And where did it go? She says the wound entered through the chest cavity, damaged the right lung, and ended just in the anterior aspect of the chest beneath the sternal notch. The sternal notch is right where you feel the top of your chest, right where your clavicle and your collarbones come together. That's your sternal notch. And so under that is where the projectile was recovered. This one was recovered during the autopsy procedure. And so the other items we see here, the large stitching down to the stomach, as well as the stitching over here, all happen to be medical intervention, correct? Let's move to exhibit number 11. There's several ones on the hand, so I'm just going to top down. There appears to be 2 injuries on the buttock/flank area of Mr. Shakur, correct? Let's talk about the lower one. Based on the review, what did that appear to be? There's an abrasion area that does not penetrate into the body. There's no evidence that within the photographs or within the autopsy report. So this is something struck that area and caused a scrape into the skin that you can see here. Do you have any opinion onto what it is? She says it could be possibly a fragment of a projectile or a projectile itself. It could be an intermediary object. An intermediary object often occurs like a gunfire goes between the object and the individual target that is being struck. So for example, if a gunfire occurs through an automobile, there may be fragments of the automobile that end up hitting the individual after the bullet or the projectile has hit the car. So it's possible that you're either dealing with a fragment from any type of object that's between the muzzle and the visual, or whether or not it's actually the projectile itself that hits the body but doesn't penetrate into the body. And then right kind of the center of the screen of his right flank, there's a fairly large injury of some sort. Did you form an opinion on what that is? That's his right thigh. Right thigh? Yeah, you said flank, and that is his right thigh. So on the lateral aspect of his right thigh is an entry gunshot wound. Can you tell me the path of that wound? This gunshot wound penetrates into the thigh and then again goes upwards into the abdominal cavity, injures several of the small intestines, and comes to rest in the anterior abdominal wall. This projectile is removed during the surgery and is documented as being removed during the surgery. The one that was at a sternal notch is still present at the time of the autopsy. She says correct. And then you see a little bit here. I'm going to move to grand jury exhibit number 12. On this right hand, did it appear to be an injury? She says yes. Did you form an opinion on what that was? She says yes. This was a through and through gunshot wound of its kind of third or fourth finger, depending on whether you count the thumb as first. This is a through and through gunshot wound through his finger. So it appears that Mr. Shakur had 2 penetrating gunshot wounds and 1 perforating gunshot wound. Correct. And based on your review of the wounds at the Clark County Coroner's Office, as well as more photographs than this, did you form an opinion as the cause of death to Mr. Shakur? She says yes. And he says, what was that? He died of multiple gunshot wounds. And did you have an opinion on the matter of death? She says yes. He says, what is that? And he says homicide. Now, normally, if someone dies immediately and gets taken to the hospital or taken directly to the Clark County Coroner's Office, there's a toxicology done. And we know it's in their system at the time they were shot, correct? Yes. Was there a toxicology done on Mr. Shakur? They say yes, correct. But that would have taken 7 days after he got shot. She says yes. The blood that was tested was taken at the autopsy. This was taken after the hospitalization. As far as your review, was there anything other than what appears to be medical intervention or medical type stuff he would have received at the hospital that within his system? She says no, there was nothing else except stuff that he would have received at the hospital, in my opinion. Okay, did I ask you this? Do you have an opinion on the matter of the cause of death to Mr. Shakur? She says yes, and it's homicide. Now, thank you. You completed my questions. Any more questions? Nope, they didn't have any more questions, and that pretty much ended. Now, this is the lady that did the autopsy on Tupac.